London, in the spring of 1819, was a city of promises kept and broken in the same breath. The air, thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, carried the sound of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones and the distant, hopeful chime of a church bell. For most, it was a season of emergence, of shrugging off the grey mantle of winter. For Adela Lanbury, it was merely a change in the quality of the light that filtered through the grimy windows of her uncle's townhouse in Bloomsbury. The light was brighter, yes, but it only served to better illuminate the dust motes dancing in the silent, stagnant air. It illuminated the cage. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a tall, narrow building of once fashionable brick, now grimed with a permanent layer of city soot. Inside, the furniture was heavy and dark, shrouded in dust sheets in rooms that were never entered. The clocks had long since stopped, their silence a more profound statement than any ticking. Adela's life was lived in a small suite of rooms at the back of the house, overlooking a patch of mossy ground that her uncle optimistically referred to as the garden. This morning, like every morning for the past 5 years since her parents' passing, began with her uncle. Rupert Lanbury was a man whose presence seemed to subtract warmth from a room. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with an air of aggrieved importance, his shoulders perpetually hunched, as if bearing the weight of a world that had failed to appreciate him. He entered her small sitting room without knocking. He never knocked. It was his house, a fact he reiterated with the tired finality of a catechism. In his hand, he held a length of fabric. It was a dull, lustreless grey, the colour of a pigeon's wing, of dishwater, of despair. "Your Modiste has sent the materials for your new day dress," he announced, his voice thin and dry as old paper. He draped the fabric over the back of a chair, where it slumped, lifeless. "I trust it is to your satisfaction." It was not a question. Adela looked from the fabric to her uncle's face. His eyes, small and pale, held a familiar glint of satisfaction. He enjoyed these small, daily cruelties. They were the substance of his power over her, dressing her in colours that drained the life from her face, insisting on styles that were a decade out of fashion, keeping her hair in a severe, unflattering knot at the nape of her neck. These were the bars of her cage, more effective than any lock or key. They were designed to make her invisible, to make her plain, to make her, in the eyes of the world, precisely what he told everyone she was. "Thank you, Uncle," she said. Her voice was quiet, even. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what he wanted. Protest was a sport. Silence was her only shield. "It is very practical. Practicality is a virtue in a young woman of your position," he said, the words a mild rebuke. "Beauty fades. Good sense endures." He gave a thin, bloodless smile. "And you have a great deal of good sense, Adela." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "Because you have little else." She did not look in the mirror often. When she did, she saw a stranger her uncle had created. A pale face, large, serious eyes, the colour of moss after rain, and a frame lost in swaths of dreary fabric. But beneath the artifice, she knew. She knew the shape of her own face, the deep auburn of her hair that her uncle insisted she powder, the straightness of her spine. She was Adela Lanbury, daughter of a man who had loved her, and a woman who had taught her to read Greek. She was not this grey ghost. She was merely in hiding. Later that day, the letter arrived. It was carried not by a footman, but by a clerk from a solicitor's office, a man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous cough. It was addressed to her uncle. Adela watched from the top of the stairs as Rupert took it into his study, the one room in the house that felt truly lived in, smelling of brandy and sealing wax. The door closed with a definitive click. She knew what it concerned. For weeks there had been whispers, low-toned conversations that ceased the moment she entered a room. Her uncle was arranging a marriage. For her. This, she knew, was the endgame. Her 24th birthday was approaching. And with it, the terms of her father's will became a pressing concern for her guardian. The vast Lanbury fortune, her fortune, was held in trust. A trust that would dissolve and pass entirely into her own hands upon her marriage. Her uncle's plan had always been clear to her. He would isolate her, render her undesirable to any man of standing, and then, in an act of apparent generosity, marry her off to one of his own creatures, an indebted crony who would allow Rupert to continue managing and pilfering from her inheritance. But the name she had overheard was not that of a crony. It was a name that echoed with power and history, a name that felt impossibly grand in the shabby silence of her uncle's house. Chasewood. The Duke of Chasewood. She could not fathom it. A duke. Why would a duke, any duke, be interested in a match with the plain, dowerless niece of Rupert Lanbury? For that was the other part of the lie. Her uncle had let it be known that her father's fortune had been all but lost, that she was little more than a charity case. The study door opened. Rupert emerged, a look of triumphant cunning on his face. It was the look of a chess player who has just cornered a king. "Adela," he said, his voice smoother than usual. "A moment of your time." She followed him into the study. The room was dominated by a large mahogany desk, its surface a chaos of papers and ledgers. He gestured for her to sit in the hard-backed chair opposite him. He remained standing, a proprietor surveying his domain. "I have news," he began, steepling his fingers. "News of a most remarkable nature. I have been in negotiations on your behalf, to secure your future." Adela waited. The silence was a weapon she had learned to wield with precision. "His Grace, the Duke of Chasewood, has made an offer of marriage." He said the words with a flourish, as if presenting her with a crown. She held his gaze. "Why?" The simple question seemed to disarm him. He blinked. "Why?" "My dear girl, one does not question such fortune. The Duke requires a wife, a duchess. You are of good family, of respectable lineage. It is a most suitable alliance." "He has never met me," she stated. It was not an accusation, merely a fact. "Such matters are often arranged between men of business," Rupert said dismissively. "His Grace is a serious man. He's not interested in the frivolities of a London season. He values discretion, modesty, a quiet nature." Adela translated the words in her head. "He's been told I am plain. He's been told I am meek. He's been told I will make no demands." And he had accepted. A man so weary of the world that he would willingly choose a grey, silent wife to be the mistress of his house and the mother of his heirs. A wife who would not trouble him with opinions or laughter or light. "And the dowry?" she asked, her voice still quiet. A flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "A suitable settlement has been reached. You need not concern yourself with the particulars. Her own money." He was using her own inheritance as a bargaining chip, a dowry to purchase a ducal coronet for a niece he had systematically tried to break. The irony was so bitter, it almost made her want to laugh. But the Duke's involvement changed the equation. Marrying a Duke was not the same as being shackled to her uncle's puppet. A Duke had his own power, his own world. A world far from this dusty house in Bloomsbury. A world in which Rupert Lanbury would have no place. This was not the trap her uncle had intended to spring. This was an escape. A dangerous, unknown, terrifying escape, but an escape nonetheless. Once the papers were signed, once the vows were spoken, she would be free. The trust would dissolve. The money, her money, would be hers. She would be the Duchess of Chasewood. She would have a name, a position, a life of her own. All she had to do was play the part her uncle had written for her, just a little while longer. "I see," she said, her eyes dropping to her hands, clasped in her lap. She made herself look small, overwhelmed. "It is a great honor, Uncle." The relief on his face was palpable. He had expected a fight, perhaps. Tears. He did not understand that she had been fighting him every day for 5 years, in the quiet fortress of her own mind. "It is," he agreed, his magnanimous tone returning. "You will be a duchess, Adela. I have done well for you." "You have done this for yourself," she thought. "But you have made a grave miscalculation. You think you are selling a broken sparrow, but you have just opened the cage for an eagle." She rose from the chair. "If you will excuse me, I should like to be alone, to contemplate my good fortune." He nodded, gratified by her apparent meekness. "Of course, my dear. Of course." She walked from the room, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not run. She did not weep. She went to her room, closed the door, and stood before the window, looking out at the patch of green. For the first time in 5 years, it did not look like a prison yard. It looked like the promise of other gardens, wider lawns, a horizon that was not bounded by a soot-stained brick wall. The Duke of Chasewood thought he was marrying a shadow. He was about to be very, very surprised. Percival Ramsay, the 8th Duke of Chasewood, stood in the library of his London residence, a glass of claret untouched on the mantelpiece beside him. The room was a sanctuary of order and silence. Books, bound in dark leather and stamped with gold, rose from floor to ceiling. The fire burned low in the grate, a quiet, steady heart in the center of the house. This was the world he understood, a world of logic, of history, of things that could be known and categorized. The world outside this room was a different matter entirely. It was a chaotic, noisy, illogical place, populated by matchmaking mamas and simpering debutantes, a world where a man's worth was measured by the cut of his coat and the size of his title. Percival was 32 years old, and he was profoundly weary of it. His man of business, Mr. Albright, a dry, precise man who had served his father before him, had just left. He had brought the signed marriage articles. It was done. In a fortnight, he would be married to a Miss Adela Lanbury. He picked up the miniature portrait that Albright had procured, at his insistence, from the bride's uncle. It was a poor thing, the work of an unskilled hand. The artist had captured a pale, solemn face, dominated by large, shadowed eyes. The hair was scraped back, the dress a shapeless blot of grey. The expression was one of blank resignation. There was no life in it, no spark. He had been told she was plain. The portrait certainly confirmed it. More than plain. Unmemorable. "She is not a diamond of the first water, Your Grace," Albright had said, with his usual tact. Her uncle describes her as modest, retiring, a young woman of simple tastes and a quiet disposition. She is healthy? Percival had asked. It was the only question that truly mattered. Robust, I am assured. And the family is sound? The Lanburys are old gentry. The money comes from commerce, 2 generations back, but the name is respectable. That was enough. Percival had no desire for a beautiful wife. Beauty, in his experience, was demanding. It required admiration, attention, constant reassurance. It came with a retinue of flatterers and a calendar full of social obligations. He had seen it with his own father's second wife, a celebrated beauty who had filled Chasewood House with noise and people, driving him deeper into the silent refuge of the library. He wanted peace. He wanted a duchess who would manage his household with quiet efficiency, produce an heir without fuss, and leave him to his books and the considerable business of managing his vast estates. Thorncroft, his primary seat in Kent, was in dire need of attention, its farms neglected, its tenants' cottages falling into disrepair after years of his father's profligate spending. That was where his duty lay. That was where he wanted to be. The rumours had already begun to circulate through the clubs and drawing rooms, that the cold, reclusive Duke of Chasewood was finally marrying, and marrying a nobody. An ugly nobody, some whispered. A blue-stocking. A spinster. Let them talk. Their opinions were less than meaningless to him. He was making a practical decision. A transaction. He would provide the name, the security, the position. She would provide a duchess, an heir, and, most importantly, an end to the ceaseless, exhausting business of the marriage market. Her uncle had assured Albright that Miss Lanbury was as eager for a quiet life as he was. It seemed a perfectly balanced equation. He set the miniature down, his decision made. He did not need to see her before the wedding. It would only create an awkwardness, a false intimacy he had no wish to perform. They would meet at the altar, speak the vows that would bind their lives together, and then begin the business of being married. It was a contract. Emotion had no place in it. He looked around the library, at the silent, steadfast companionship of his books. He was not a cold man, not truly, but the warmth he possessed was buried deep, shielded by years of disappointment and a profound sense of duty that often felt more like a burden. His younger brother, Edward, had been the charming one, the one who moved through the world with an easy grace. But Edward was gone, lost to a fever in Portugal 2 years ago, and the weight of the dukedom had settled fully on Percival's shoulders. He had a duty to marry, to secure the line. He would do his duty. He would marry the plain Miss Lanbury, and in return, he would have his peace. It was a fair price. He was certain of it. The 2 weeks passed in a flurry of legal arrangements and quiet preparations. Adela saw her uncle only fleetingly. He was busy, he said, settling her affairs. In truth, he was extracting every last shilling he could from the estate before he lost control of it. Adela did not care. Let him have his scraps. She was about to inherit a kingdom. The modiste came and went, fitting the grey wedding dress under Rupert's watchful eye. It was a severe, high-necked gown with long sleeves, designed to conceal rather than reveal. The only concession to the occasion was the fabric, a heavy silk that rustled like dry leaves, and the veil. The veil was of a thick, opaque lace, a veritable shroud. A bride should be modest before her husband, Rupert had declared, holding the lace up to the light. There will be time enough for acquaintance later. Adela knew the veil served another purpose. It would keep her face hidden until the very last moment, ensuring the Duke could not cry off, ensuring the contract was sealed. Her uncle was leaving nothing to chance. On the final evening in the Bloomsbury house, Adela packed a small trunk herself. She did not pack the grey dresses or the drab shawls. She packed the few things that were truly hers. A small collection of books, her mother's locket, and a portfolio of drawings she had made in secret. Architectural sketches of imagined houses, light-filled and open to the sky. She packed the tools of her own quiet rebellion. As she closed the lid, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and she did not know if the chasm below held ruin or salvation. But the air she was breathing was, for the first time, the air of freedom. Tomorrow, she would become the Duchess of Chasewood. Tomorrow, the ghost her uncle had created would vanish, and Adela Lanbury would finally step into the light. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The wedding was held in St. George's, Hanover Square, but it felt less like a society event and more like a clandestine transaction. The church was cavernous and empty, save for the necessary parties. Percival stood at the altar, ramrod straight in a coat of dark blue superfine wool. Beside him was a distant cousin, who served as his witness. On the other side stood Adela, a slim, grey figure, with her uncle at her elbow, his hand gripping her arm a little too tightly. The Duke's formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Chasewood, sat alone in the front pew, her expression unreadable. Adela moved through the ceremony as if in a dream. The bishop's voice droned on, the words of the service ancient and impersonal. She made her responses in a clear, low voice, the sound shockingly loud in the echoing silence. Through the thick mesh of her veil, the world was a blur of stone and shadow. She could see the Duke only as a tall, imposing silhouette. He was a stranger. Her husband. When the time came for the exchange of rings, his hand was cool and firm as he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger. Her own hand trembled slightly as she placed a ring on his. The touch was brief, impersonal, the only physical contact they had shared. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the bishop declared. He cleared his throat. "Your Grace, you may greet your bride." This was the moment. The unveiling. Percival turned to her. He moved with a deliberate, almost reluctant grace. He was, she had been told, performing a duty. He reached for her veil. The silence in the church was absolute. 1 second. 2 seconds. Rupert held his breath. The lace lifted. For a moment, Percival did not react. He simply stood, his hands holding the edges of the veil, his gaze locked on her face. Adela met his eyes directly. She did not smile. She did not blush or look away. She simply held his gaze, allowing him to see her, to truly see her for the first time. The face before him was not the one from the miniature, not even close. The artist had not been merely unskilled. He had been a liar, or he had been instructed to lie. The woman he had just married was no plain, unmemorable girl. Her face was a perfect oval, her skin pale and luminous in the watery light filtering through the stained glass. Her brows were delicately arched over large, intelligent eyes, not the shadowed voids of the portrait, but a clear, deep green, like moss in a forest glade. Her mouth, which the painter had rendered as a thin, grim line, was full and beautifully shaped. And her hair, freed from its severe bun and arranged for the wedding, was not a dull brown, but a rich, vibrant auburn, catching the light like threads of polished copper. She was not just not ugly. She was, by any standard, a breathtakingly beautiful woman. A wave of shock, cold and sharp, washed over him. He felt the blood drain from his face. He had been a fool. A colossal, unsuspecting fool. This was a trick, a bait and switch of the highest order. He had contracted for a plough horse and been presented with a thoroughbred. And thoroughbreds, as he knew all too well, were never peaceful. His eyes, dark brown and suddenly hard as stone, narrowed. The shock curdled into suspicion, then into a cold, quiet rage. He looked from her face to her uncle, who was now beaming, a greasy, self-congratulatory smile plastered on his face. And then he looked back at her. Was she a party to this? This silent, beautiful creature with the unsettlingly steady gaze. Had she been laughing at him all this while? The meek, retiring spinster? It was a farce. He dropped the veil. He did not kiss her. He turned to the bishop, his face a mask of iron control. The documents are signed. We are concluded here. The journey to Thorncroft was made in the Duke's travelling coach, a large, well-sprung vehicle that swallowed the miles with quiet efficiency. It could have been comfortable. Instead, it was a torture chamber of silence. Percival sat opposite Adela, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. He had not spoken a single word to her since leaving the church. He stared out the window, his expression grim, as if the rolling hills of the Kentish countryside were a personal affront. Adela sat in her own corner, her hands clasped in her lap. The grey silk of her wedding dress felt like a costume from a play that had ended badly. She understood his shock. She had anticipated it. But she had not been prepared for the sheer, freezing force of his anger. He felt betrayed. He thought she had deceived him. She could explain. She could tell him about her uncle, about the years of quiet subjugation, about the drab dresses and the lies. But how could she? To defend herself would be to accuse her own guardian on her wedding day. It would sound like a desperate, self-serving fabrication. And she would not beg. She had not escaped one cage only to plead for kindness in another. So she remained silent. She watched the landscape slide by. Green fields, tidy hedgerows, the first blossoms of spring on the apple trees. It was beautiful, a world of colour and life. And yet, inside the carriage, the air was thick with a winter that refused to end. They arrived at Thorncroft as dusk was falling. The house was magnificent. It was not a classical, symmetrical palace, like so many ducal seats. It was an older house, a sprawling Tudor manor of warm, honey-coloured stone and dark timber, with mullioned windows that glittered like 1,000 eyes in the fading light. It looked less like it had been built, and more like it had grown from the very land it stood upon. It felt alive. The household staff was assembled in the great hall to greet their new duchess. An elderly, severe-looking housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, stood at their head, her hands clasped at her waist. They stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They too had heard the rumours. They were expecting the plain, mousy bride. Adela stepped out of the carriage, her back straight. She had removed the oppressive veil. She met their stares with the same quiet dignity with which she had met her husband's. A low murmur rippled through the staff. Percival brushed past her without a word and strode into the house. "Mrs. Graves," he said, his voice clipped. "Her Grace will be shown to the Duchess's apartments. I will be in my study." He did not look at Adela. He did not introduce her. He simply abandoned her on the threshold of her new home, in front of her new staff. The insult was public, deliberate, and deeply wounding. Adela felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her head high. She turned to the housekeeper. Mrs. Graves's eyes, sharp and intelligent, assessed her in a single sweeping glance. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice surprisingly gentle as she dropped a small curtsy. "Welcome to Thorncroft. If you will follow me." The Duchess's apartments were beautiful, a suite of rooms in the east wing, with a large canopied bed, a sitting room with a fireplace, and windows that looked out over a vast, formal garden, its intricate patterns just visible in the twilight. It was a princess's bower, and a prison. Her trunks had been brought up. A young maid, with wide, curious eyes, was waiting to help her unpack. "What is your name?" Adela asked, her voice steady. "Agnes, Your Grace," the girl whispered, bobbing a curtsy. "Thank you, Agnes. You may help me out of this dress. Then I should like a bath, and a simple supper here, in my rooms." She would not be going down to dinner. She would not sit in silence at the other end of a long, polished table, from a man who despised her. The battle had been joined. And the first rule of warfare was to choose your ground. Tonight, this room was her ground. Later, as she lay in the enormous bed, the fine linen cool against her skin, Adela allowed herself a moment of weakness. A single tear traced a path down her temple and into her hair. He thought she was a liar. A beautiful, scheming liar. Her uncle's plan had failed, but he had succeeded in poisoning her escape. She had won her freedom from him, only to find herself shackled to a stranger's contempt. She turned onto her side, facing the dark, unfamiliar room. The house was silent around her. It felt like it was watching, waiting. She had survived 5 years with Rupert Lanbury. She would survive the Duke of Chasewood. She had to. She closed her eyes, and through sheer force of will, fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. Days at Thorncroft settled into a strange, strained routine. Adela and Percival lived in the same house, under the same roof, but as two planets in separate orbits, held together only by the invisible gravity of their vows. They saw each other at meals, which they took in a cavernous dining hall at a table so long they might as well have been in different rooms. Their conversation was excruciatingly polite and utterly meaningless. "Is the tea to your liking, Your Grace?" "It is excellent, thank you." "The post has arrived from London." "Indeed." The Duke spent his days either locked in his study with his estate manager, or riding out across his lands, his face set in a grim mask. He was avoiding her. That much was clear. He was a man who had been presented with a problem he did not know how to solve, and so he had chosen to ignore it. Adela, however, refused to be ignored. She was the Duchess of Chasewood. This was her home now, and she would not be a ghost in it. On the third morning, she came down to the dining hall before him. A footman was setting 2 places at opposite ends of the gleaming expanse of mahogany. "Good morning, Thomas," she said. "From now on, we will take our meals at this end of the table." She indicated the end nearer the fire. "Please set 2 places side by side." The footman stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "Side by side, Your Grace?" "Yes," she said, her tone pleasant but firm. "It seems a great waste of heat to sit so far from the fire, does it not?" When Percival entered the room, he stopped short. The table had been reset as she had instructed. Adela was already seated, a book open beside her plate. She looked up and met his gaze. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said calmly. "I hope you slept well." He stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance? Surprise? He was being maneuvered, and he knew it. But to object would be to engage, to admit that the seating arrangement mattered. It would be an admission of hostility. He gave a stiff, formal nod and took the seat beside her. The proximity was startling. She could smell the scent of soap and clean linen from his cravat. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his dark brown eyes. The silence between them was no longer distant and echoing. It was close, charged, and deeply uncomfortable. He did not speak a word throughout the meal. But he had sat down. It was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. Adela began to explore the house. Thorncroft was a labyrinth of corridors, galleries, and forgotten rooms. It was a house that held centuries of secrets. She found her way to the library. It was even grander than the one in London, a magnificent two-storied room with a gallery running around the upper level. It smelled of leather and beeswax and thyme. This was his sanctuary. She knew she was trespassing. But the books called to her. She ran her fingers along their spines, reading the titles. History, philosophy, science, poetry. And on the lower shelves, a large collection of works on agriculture, engineering, and architecture. She began to spend her afternoons there. She would choose a book and settle in a window seat, losing herself in its pages. She was careful not to disturb the Duke's papers, which were laid out in neat stacks on a massive table. She was a quiet, unobtrusive presence. But she was there. One afternoon, he found her there. He had entered so silently, she hadn't heard him. She looked up from her book, a treatise on Palladian design, to find him standing by the fireplace, watching her. His expression was not angry, merely watchful. "You find the collection to your liking?" he asked. His voice was low, formal. "It is magnificent," she said honestly. "I have never seen so many books in one place." He inclined his head. "My great-grandfather was a collector." He walked over to the table where she was sitting. He glanced at the open book. Palladio, an ambitious choice. "I enjoy architecture," she said. "The logic of it. The way a structure can create not just shelter, but a feeling. Space. Light." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "My father had little interest in such things. He preferred to spend his money on racehorses." There was a bitter edge to his voice. "Thorncroft is a beautiful house," she said softly. "It has wonderful bones." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "The bones are sound. It's the skin that's the problem. The roof leaks in 3 wings. There is dry rot in the west gallery, and the tenants' farms are paying half what they should." He was talking to her. Not as a duchess, not as a suspicious stranger, but as a person. He was sharing the weight of his burden with her. "It is a great undertaking," she said, her voice full of a sympathy she knew he would not welcome, but could not deny. "It is my duty," he said, his mask of cool detachment slipping back into place. He turned and walked towards the large desk that was his command post. The conversation was over. But it had happened. A crack had appeared in the wall of ice between them. A few days later, Adela was walking in the gardens, or what was left of them. The formal parterres were overgrown with weeds, the fountains dry and cracked. It was a place of faded grandeur, of sad, beautiful decay. She was sketching in her notebook, reimagining the lines of the garden, when she saw a small child, no older than 7, sitting on the edge of a crumbling stone bench, crying. He was a grubby little boy in patched breeches, clearly the son of a tenant or a servant. He was clutching his knee, where a long, bloody scrape was welling up. Adela closed her sketchbook and went to him. "Hello," she said gently. "That looks like a nasty fall." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear. He had been told, no doubt, to stay away from the great house, and especially from its new, mysterious mistress. He scrambled to his feet, ready to bolt. "It's all right," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You needn't run. Let me see." She knelt on the gravel path, ignoring the fine wool of her walking dress. She took out a clean handkerchief from her pocket. "This might sting a little," she warned, before gently dabbing the dirt from the wound. The boy flinched but stood still, watching her with a kind of awe. "There," she said, when she was done. "That's better. Now, what is your name?" "Tom, ma'am," he mumbled. "My da's the head gardener." "Well, Tom, I think you have been very brave." She smiled, a real warm smile. "Now, you had best run along, but try to stay away from that broken step, shall you?" He nodded, gave her one last wide-eyed look, and then scampered away, his tears forgotten. Adela rose and brushed the dust from her skirts. When she turned, she saw the Duke. He was standing by the entrance to the rose garden, perhaps 50 feet away. He must have seen the whole exchange. He did not move, did not speak. He simply watched her, his face a study in stillness. Then, without a nod or a sign of acknowledgement, he turned and walked back toward the house. That evening at dinner, the silence felt different. It was less hostile, more contemplative. As they were finishing their soup, he spoke. "The boy, Tom. His mother has been ill." Adela looked up, surprised. "I am sorry to hear it. Mrs. Graves takes a broth to their cottage each day, but the girl, Agnes, tells me you sent down a pot of honey from the kitchens this afternoon." Adela felt a flush of colour rise in her cheeks. She had not meant for him to know. "Honey is good for a cough," she said simply. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He was trying to reconcile the woman who knelt in the dirt to tend to a child's scraped knee with the scheming beauty he imagined her to be. The two images did not align. He was a man of logic, and the evidence was beginning to contradict his initial conclusion. "It was a kindness," he said, the words sounding stiff and unfamiliar on his tongue. "It was nothing," she replied, "but it was something. She knew it, and he knew it. It was another small chip in the ice." A week later, Percival was in his study late at night, wrestling with a set of accounts that refused to balance. His father's chaotic bookkeeping was a nightmare. He was tired, and a headache was beginning to pound at his temples. There was a soft knock at the door. "Enter," he called, his voice rough with fatigue. Adela came in. She was wearing a simple dressing gown of deep blue velvet, her auburn hair in a long braid over her shoulder. In her hands, she carried a silver tray with a single cup on it. "I saw the light under your door," she said, her voice low so as not to wake the sleeping house. "I thought you might be working still. I asked Mrs. Graves for some chamomile tea." She set the tray down on the edge of his desk, next to a mountain of paperwork. The scent of the steam, fragrant and calming, rose into the air. He stared at her. His first instinct was suspicion. What did she want? What was this new tactic? But then he looked at her face. There was no artifice there. Her expression was one of genuine concern. She looked as tired as he felt. "Thank you," he said. The words came out more softly than he intended. "You work too hard," she said. It was not a criticism, just an observation. She gestured to the chaotic piles of ledgers. "Is this my father-in-law's legacy?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Among other things. He had a talent for spending money, and a genius for not recording where it went." She came to stand beside his chair, looking down at the papers. "May I?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. She picked up a ledger, her fingers surprisingly deft as she flipped through the pages. "My father was a merchant before he inherited my grandfather's estate," she said, almost to herself. "He taught me double-entry bookkeeping. He said it was more useful for a woman than embroidery." She pointed to a column of figures. "This is your error. You have carried this sum as a debit when it was a credit from the sale of timber." He leaned closer, following her finger. She was right. The numbers, which had been a meaningless jumble to his tired brain, suddenly clicked into place. He'd been staring at it for an hour and had not seen it. "How did you—" "I told you," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I enjoy logic." He looked up at her. They were standing very close. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. He could smell the clean, fresh scent of her hair. His headache was gone. In its place was a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. This woman was his wife. She was not a schemer. She was not a frivolous beauty. She was intelligent. She was kind. She was capable. And he had treated her with nothing but cold, suspicious contempt since the moment he had laid eyes on her. A wave of shame, profound and sharp, washed over him. "Adela," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She met his gaze. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the things that had not been said between them for weeks. He began, but he did not know how to finish. How to apologize for his boorishness, for his cruelty, for being so profoundly, utterly wrong about her. The library clock, which the staff had wound at her request, began to chime midnight. 12 slow, resonant chimes that measured the passing of one day into the next, measured the passing of one era of their marriage into another. When the last chime faded, she simply said, "You should get some rest, Your Grace." She turned and left the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving him alone with the cooling cup of tea and the sudden, startling realization that his carefully constructed, peaceful, and emotionless life was about to become very complicated indeed. He was beginning to feel something for his wife, and it felt dangerously like admiration. The thaw, once begun, accelerated. Percival found himself seeking her out, inventing reasons to be in her company. He would ask her opinion on plans for a new drainage system for the low-lying fields, and she would offer surprisingly practical insights. He would read poetry aloud in the library in the evenings, and she would listen, her hands busy with a sketch pad, a quiet, appreciative audience of one. He learned the landscape of her face, the way her brow furrowed in concentration when she was reading, the small smile that played on her lips when she was amused, the deep, clear stillness of her eyes when she was thoughtful. He learned that her quietness was not meekness, but strength. It was the self-possession of someone who knew her own mind and had no need to shout to be heard. He began to understand that the woman he had married was not a deception. She was a revelation. The true deception had been the story he had been told. the story he had been all too willing to believe because it suited his own prejudices about the world. The peace he had so desperately craved was being replaced by something else, a disquiet, an awareness of her presence in every corner of the house, a longing to hear her voice, to see her smile. The cold, logical fortress of his heart was being dismantled, stone by stone, by a woman who had never once raised her voice against him. His coldness toward her had been a shield, but he was beginning to realize it had not been shielding him from her. It had been shielding him from himself, from the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of feeling something again. One rainy afternoon, he found her in the West Gallery, a long, draughty corridor lined with portraits of his ancestors. The roof was leaking, as he'd said, and a steady drip, drip, drip into a strategically placed bucket was the only sound. Adela was standing before a portrait of a woman with auburn hair and a gentle, intelligent face. "My grandmother," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The one who was at our wedding." "She is beautiful," Adela said. "She is formidable," he corrected, though without heat. "She lives at her own estate in Surrey. She writes to me every week, asking why we have not yet come to London." "And what do you tell her?" "I tell her we are settling in." Adela turned from the portrait to look at him. "Are we, Percival?" She had used his name. "Not Your Grace. Percival." The sound of it on her lips was both startling and deeply, profoundly right. It was an offering of intimacy, a question that demanded an honest answer. He looked at her, at the earnest, open expression on her face, and knew that he could no longer hide behind his ducal title. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "We are not, and it is entirely my fault." He took a breath. The apology he had rehearsed 100 times in the silence of his own mind finally came out. "I owe you an apology, Adela. I have behaved abominably. I was told a lie, and I chose to believe it. I judged you without evidence, and I treated you without courtesy or respect. There is no excuse for it. I am deeply sorry." She searched his face, her green eyes full of a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. She did not offer easy forgiveness. She simply nodded, a small, accepting gesture. "You believed what you were told," she said. "It is an easy trap to fall into." "But I saw the truth on our wedding day," he insisted, his voice raw with self-reproach. "And I chose to believe you were the liar, not your uncle. I was angry that my simple, uncomplicated transaction had suddenly become complicated." "And is it still so complicated?" she asked softly. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the last of his defenses crumbled. "Yes," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It is more complicated than I could ever have imagined, and I find I do not mind it in the least." In that damp, echoing gallery, with the rain drumming on the roof, and his ancestors watching from their gilded frames, the Duke of Chasewood finally, truly, met his wife. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he was falling in love with her. The moment of peace was shattered a week later by the unexpected arrival of a carriage. Percival, seeing it from his study window, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He recognized the crest on the door. It was Rupert Lanbury. He had come uninvited. Adela was in the garden, directing the gardeners who were clearing the overgrown parterres, when her uncle found her. He descended upon her like a bird of prey, his face pinched with fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He gestured around at the activity. "Playing the grand lady. I have not received a single word from you since you left my house, and my letters to the Duke go unanswered." Adela met his fury with a calm she did not feel. "I have been occupied, uncle, setting my new house in order." "Your house?" he sneered. "This is his house. You are here on his sufferance, a fact you seem to have forgotten. You were supposed to be a quiet, grateful, manageable wife. Instead, I hear rumors that you have taken over, that you have him wrapped around your little finger." "The Duke and I have an understanding," she said, her voice cool. "I am sure you do," Rupert said, his eyes glittering with malice. "You played your part well, I'll grant you, the blushing, hidden bride. But the game is over. You have what you wanted. Now, about the matter of my expenses. I incurred significant costs in arranging this match, in maintaining you for all those years. A debt of gratitude is owed, and it must be paid." He was trying to blackmail her, to reassert his control through threats and intimidation. The old fear, the familiar feeling of being trapped, washed over her. But it was different now. She was not the girl in the Bloomsbury townhouse anymore. "I owe you nothing, uncle," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "The trust is dissolved. My fortune is my own. You will not see another penny of it." His face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful wretch! After everything I did for you, I made you a duchess. You would be nothing without me, a penniless spinster. Do not forget that I know things about you, about your mother, things the good Duke might not find so respectable." It was an empty threat, but it was delivered with the intent to wound. Adela flinched. "That is quite enough, Lanbury." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a whip. Percival was standing not 10 feet away, by the yew hedge. He had heard everything. His face was pale, his dark eyes burning with a cold, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than Rupert's sputtering rage. He walked toward them, his steps measured. He did not look at Adela. His entire focus was on her uncle. "You are not welcome in this house," Percival said, his voice dangerously soft. "You came here to threaten my wife, the Duchess of Chasewood. You will leave. Now." Rupert's blustering faded, replaced by a sullen resentment. He had misjudged the Duke as badly as he had misjudged his niece. He had assumed a man who would agree to marry a plain bride was a weak man. He was learning, too late, that he was very wrong. "I am her guardian," he stammered. "Her family." "You are nothing to her," Percival stated, his voice like chips of ice. She's my family now. If you ever attempt to contact her or me again, if you breathe a single word against her name in public or in private, I will use the full extent of my influence and my resources to utterly destroy you. I will ruin your credit. I will see you blackballed from every club in London. I will ensure that every door in polite society is slammed in your face. Am I making myself clear?" Rupert paled. He looked from the Duke's implacable face to Adela's. She was no longer afraid. She was watching her husband, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning wonder. She was being defended. She was being protected. Without another word, Rupert turned and scurried away, a small, defeated man retreating from a battle he had already lost. Percival watched him go. Then he turned to Adela. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and strong. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice losing its hard edge, softening with concern. She could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. "He will not trouble you again," he promised. He looked down at their joined hands. He was right about one thing, though. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "What is that?" "You do have me wrapped around your little finger," he said, and this time it was a full, genuine smile. A smile that transformed his serious face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "And I am yours, Adela, completely and irrevocably." She squeezed his hand, her own smile finally breaking through. "And I am yours, Percival." They stood there for a long moment in the resurrected garden, husband and wife, a team. The war was not over, but they would face the next battle together. Their return to London was a strategic campaign planned with military precision. The Dowager Duchess, Augusta, a woman with the sharp mind of a field marshal and the social influence of a queen, was their greatest ally. Having been apprised of the situation by a long, candid letter from her grandson, she was incandescent with rage at Rupert Lanbury and fiercely protective of her new granddaughter-in-law. "The man is a viper," she had written back in her spidery, elegant hand, "and the ton is a pit of them. We must not simply defend, we must attack. We will host a ball. Here, at Chasewood House. We will reintroduce the Duchess to a society that thinks it knows her. We will show them how very wrong they are." Rupert, true to his nature, had not gone quietly into the night. Humiliated and furious, he had spent the intervening weeks poisoning the wells of society gossip. The story he spun was a masterpiece of malicious invention. The new Duchess of Chasewood, he whispered, was not just plain. She was a cunning, ill-tempered shrew. She had trapped the poor Duke, a man of simple tastes, and now led him a merry dance. She was a country rustic with no breeding, who had refused to come to London because she lacked the grace for it. He painted her as an embarrassment, a millstone around the noble Duke's neck. And society, hungry for scandal, had eagerly consumed the lies. The drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with speculation. Everyone was desperate to see the ugly, shrewish Duchess for themselves. The night of the ball arrived. Chasewood House, which had been dark for seasons, was ablaze with light. Hundreds of candles glittered in the crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished floors and gilded mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and hothouse flowers. All of London society was there, drawn by the irresistible lure of a potential train wreck. Upstairs, in her dressing room, Adela stood before a full-length mirror. She was not the same woman who had left London in a grey silk gown. The months at Thorncroft, the quiet joy of her unfolding relationship with Percival, the simple act of being seen and valued for who she was, had transformed her. A new confidence radiated from her, a serene self-possession that was more compelling than any conventional beauty. Her gown was a testament to this transformation. At her request, it was not white or pastel, the typical colours for a new bride. It was a deep, luminous emerald green, the colour of the moss in the woods at Thorncroft. The silk shimmered as she moved, cut in a simple, elegant Grecian style that fell from a high waist to the floor. It needed no lace, no frills, no artifice. Her only jewellery was a pair of pearl earrings and her mother's locket tucked discreetly inside her bodice. Her auburn hair was not tortured into elaborate curls, but swept up simply, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked like herself. Percival came to stand behind her. He was magnificent in formal evening attire, his dark auburn hair catching the candlelight. He met her eyes in the mirror, his own filled with a mixture of pride, adoration, and love that still made her heart ache. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She took a deep breath. I am nervous. So am I, he admitted, surprising her. He took her hands, his grip warm and reassuring. But we will face them together. Just remember, you are not on trial here. They are. You are the Duchess of Chasewood. You are my wife, and you are the most intelligent, courageous, and beautiful woman I have ever known. Let them look. Let them see what I see. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was a promise and a prayer. Downstairs, the ballroom was packed. The orchestra was playing a waltz, but few were dancing. The entire assembly was crowded near the grand staircase, their faces turned upward in collective anticipation. Rupert Lanbury stood near the entrance, a smug, vindictive smile on his face, surrounded by a small circle of his cronies. He was poised to enjoy his moment of triumph, the public humiliation of the girl who had dared to defy him. The Dowager Duchess stood at the base of the stairs, her back ramrod straight, a diamond tiara glittering in her white hair. She surveyed the room with an imperious gaze, daring anyone to misbehave. Then the majordomo's voice rang out. His Grace, the Duke of Chasewood, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Chasewood. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was fixed on the top of the staircase. They appeared. Percival, tall and imposing, every inch the powerful Duke. And on his arm, Adela. The silence was no longer merely expectant. It was a silence of collective, profound shock. This was not the woman they had been led to expect. This was not the plain, dowdy, awkward country mouse. The woman descending the stairs was a vision of grace and elegance. Her head was held high, her expression serene. She moved with an unstudied poise that made every other woman in the room suddenly look overdressed and overwrought. The emerald green of her gown was a bold, confident statement in a sea of pale silks. She was, in a word, stunning. A low, astonished murmur swept through the ballroom, the sound of 100 whispered lies dying at once. Rupert Lanbury's smile froze, then collapsed. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. This was not possible. This was not the creature he had created, the ghost he had kept in the shadows. This was a queen, and she was looking down on them all with a calm, regal composure that utterly dismantled his narrative. Percival led Adela down the stairs. He did not hurry. He savoured the moment, his eyes never leaving his wife's face, a look of undisguised devotion, plain for all to see. Their united front was a fortress. The rumours of a trapped, unhappy duke evaporated in the face of such obvious, palpable love. They reached the bottom of the stairs, where the Dowager was waiting. Augusta's stern face broke into a rare, brilliant smile. She took Adela's free hand. "My dear," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Welcome home." It was a public anointing, an acceptance, a declaration of allegiance. The Tun, ever slavish to the cues of its most powerful matriarchs, understood instantly. The battle was over. The new Duchess had won. The orchestra, taking its cue from the Dowager, struck up a new waltz. Percival led Adela onto the floor. "You have rendered them speechless," he murmured into her ear as he swept her into the dance. "It is you they are looking at," she replied, her hand resting on his shoulder. "They have never seen you smile so much." "I have never had so much reason to smile." They danced, oblivious to the eyes upon them, two people in a world of their own. They moved in perfect harmony, a physical expression of the intellectual and emotional union they had forged in the quiet rooms of Thorncroft. Across the room, Rupert watched them, his face ashen. His defeat was total and absolute. He tried to approach a group of acquaintances, but they turned their backs on him, suddenly fascinated by a floral arrangement. He was a pariah. The poison he had tried to spread had only infected himself. There was a quiet sadness in his ruin. He was a small, grasping man, driven by fear and greed, and in trying to cage another, he had only succeeded in locking himself out of everything he craved. He turned and slipped out of the ballroom, a ghost leaving his own haunting. Later that evening, standing on a balcony overlooking the gardens, Adela breathed in the cool night air. Percival came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "The lion's den was not so frightening after all," she said, leaning back against his chest. "That is because you were the lioness," he said, his lips brushing her hair. She turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me, for fighting for me." "Always," he promised. "I was a fool, Adela. I was looking for a life without feeling, and you taught me that a life without feeling is not a life at all." He traced the line of her jaw with his finger. "You unlocked more than just your inheritance when you married me. You unlocked my heart." She raised her hand to his cheek, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "And you, my darling husband, you gave me back my name, and then you gave me yours." He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss full of all the love that had grown between them in the quiet countryside, now proclaimed in the heart of London for all the world to see. The lies had been loud, but the truth, they had discovered, had a quiet, unshakable power of its own. The truth was love. Epilogue. 1 year later, the gardens at Thorncroft were in full bloom. What had been a wilderness of weeds and decay was now a masterpiece of colour and design. Orderly rows of lavender scented the air, and a profusion of roses, white, pink, and a deep, velvety red, climbed the ancient stone walls. The fountains, their stone basins repaired, now sent sparkling jets of water into the summer sky. Adela, Duchess of Chasewood, stood on the newly paved terrace. A large roll of architectural drawings spread out on a stone table before her. She was wearing a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin, her auburn hair tied back in a practical but elegant knot. A faint smudge of charcoal was on her cheek. She was no longer just the mistress of Thorncroft. She was its co-creator, its visionary. The renovations to the house were well underway, guided by her meticulous plans. The west gallery no longer leaked. Its rotten timbers had been replaced, and its newly plastered walls awaited a fresh collection of art. Light and air now filled rooms that had been dark and musty for decades. The house was breathing again. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him. She looked up, her face breaking into a warm, welcoming smile. Percival had changed as much as the house had. The grim, weary man who had married a stranger was gone. In his place was a man at ease with himself and the world, his serious expression more often than not softened by a quiet contentment. The weight of his duty was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was a shared joy. He came and stood beside her, his arms sliding around her waist. He dropped a kiss on her charcoal-smudged cheek. "Planning your next conquest?" he murmured, looking down at the drawings. They were plans for a new schoolhouse in the village. "A necessary one," she said. "The children deserve better than a drafty room in the back of the church. And you will ensure they have it," he said, his voice full of pride. He looked from the plans to her face. Augusta writes that London is desolate without you. She says you have ruined the season, for no one else is half so interesting. Adela laughed. Your grandmother is a shameless flatterer. Besides, I have no desire to be interesting to the ton. All the interest I require is right here. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the landscape they were healing together. The fields were green and productive, the tenants' cottages repaired and whitewashed, their gardens overflowing with vegetables. Thorncroft was becoming what it was always meant to be, not just a ducal seat, but a thriving, prosperous community. Do you ever miss it? He asked quietly. The life you might have had, if you hadn't been forced into this arrangement? She turned to face him, her expression serious. She took his face in her hands. Forced? My darling, it was the first real choice I ever made. I chose to escape. I chose to take a chance on a cold, distant duke. She smiled. It was the best decision of my life. I would not change a single moment. Not the grey dresses, not the horrible silence in the carriage, not even my uncle's cruelty. Because it all led me here. To you. He pulled her close, his heart full. The quiet, peaceful life he had thought he wanted would have been a pale, lifeless thing compared to this. This vibrant, challenging, joyful life with her. She had not brought him peace. She had brought him passion, laughter, purpose. She had brought him home to himself. I love you, Adela, he whispered against her hair. And I love you, Percival. The truth, once revealed, had not been a momentary flash of light. It was a steady, enduring flame that warmed them both. A beacon in the home they had built not of stone and timber, but of trust, respect, and a love that had quietly, patiently, outlasted all the lies in the world. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.